Good morning. So glad to be up here. It has been several months since the last time I preached, and it's been, I think, like a year since the last time I preached here, so great to be up here. I'm a pulpit preacher, so I had to grab this, but apparently Glenn ordered a pulpit this week, so that should be coming soon. I can't hold my tablet and speak at the same time like he does. And we just have the one slide, so if you rely on the slides heavily during service, you're going to want to pay attention to what I'm saying. So, you got to actually pay attention to the speaker this morning. So, we're going to begin with reading the scripture passage, which is John chapter 11, the whole chapter, I know, for our word this morning. And I'm reading from the NIV. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who had poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard about Lazarus being sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days, and then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So when he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been dead for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here's the man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation." Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that this is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish." He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all?" But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it, so they might arrest him. This is God's word. Looking at this passage, it's clear that it has a specific topic and theme that I think is very important for this time of year. Not only that, but I believe that God had a plan for me to speak on this topic after coming through this past week. That became abundantly clear. And throughout this year, the last few years, or even the last several years, I'm sure we have all lost something or someone that changes the way we feel, or changes the way we feel about the upcoming season. With tomorrow being Veterans Day, or Remembrance Day, as our brothers and sisters to the north call it, and Thanksgiving and Christmas just around the corner, the white stuff on the ground, that makes it abundantly clear that this season is coming. It's supposed to be a time of celebration, a time to be thankful for what God has given us, a time to celebrate the coming of our Lord and look forward to his return. But loss can make this time of year very hard for so many of us. The absence of a special person around this time can be so heartbreaking, especially when thinking about that person's role in this time of year. Thinking back through the years and the traditions and little rituals that we all have that they might do as part of the celebration. Or even my own mother. Many of you know her, and some may know that her father passed away a few days after Christmas a few years ago. And like some of us here, at one point or another, she didn't have a great relationship with him, but it still affects her around this time. I personally haven't had much experience with loss or grief when it comes to those who are really close to me, thank God. So I don't know really how hard it can be for some people personally. The only time, and the first time I really did ever have a taste of grief, was just a few years ago. A very good friend of mine from school, not that we were exceptionally close, but I felt like we had a good thing going. We enjoyed each other's company when we did spend time together. One summer in the middle, he was away. He was at Indiana. He was at headquarters, Wesleyan headquarters, for like an internship kind of thing. And in the middle of the summer, he went to bed one night and just didn't wake up the next morning. A young man, probably about the same age that I am now. He was married. He was on fire for God and did everything he could to serve God's kingdom at any given moment. Apparently it was because he had sleep apnea, and he, like I said, just didn't wake up. Another friend from school, they were down there together, and he was actually the one who found him. And after that happened, after my friend passed away, I was grieving for a really long time. I actually had to get some counseling from Pastor John at one point just because it hit me so hard. I'd never lost someone like that before. And there were some times I honestly don't think I handled my grief as well as I could have. You know, I wept for a long time. I was really confused. I was like, here's this young guy on fire for Christ, and you take him. Why? I was a little angry with God for taking him so early in life, taking him away from his wife, from his friends, his family, his ministry. And I'm sure I'm not alone when it comes to facing grief poorly. We all face suffering, tragedy, trials, and grief in this life. And it's all due to sin being in the world. Whether it's the loss of a friend or a loved one to death, the ending of any kind of relationship, or the loss of one's job or home, people use different coping mechanisms to help them with the pain that comes with grief and loss. Some turn to the bottle, some turn to harming themselves or overeating or any other number of coping mechanisms that we can come up with. Sometimes we can be like Mary and Martha in our scripture passage today. When the suffering and the pain come, we turn to God, sometimes in anger, and ask, "Where were you? Why weren't you here to stop this?" Now, before I go any further, just so I'm not accused of plagiarism or anything, I do want to say that this message is heavily influenced by my favorite preacher, Reverend Timothy Keller of Redeemer Presbyterian Church down in New York City. He has a way of preaching that I really connect to, and the way he says things make a tremendous amount of sense to me. So I find a lot of inspiration, and he indirectly pours into me and my ministry because I listen to his stuff and I get poured into, and then I'm able to pour out onto the teens and the church and everything. So, but the message that this one is heavily influenced on, he preached literally the Friday just after the 9/11 attacks. And in that message, he points out 4 ways in the passage that we read, John chapter 11, that Jesus gives us the perfect example of dealing with grief, whether it's our own grief or the grief of those around us. Before we get into those points, though, I do want to point out that by showing us through his example in this passage, God also shows us how he grieves. We get to see a little bit of how God works in our passage, which I think is really neat. He grieves for us. He grieves with us. He grieves too, which is really important because rarely does a God in any other religion grieve alongside humanity. So the first way that Jesus shows us how to deal with grief is through his tears. Through his tears. It's been a joke in some Christian circles that John chapter 11, verse 35 is one of the easiest verses in the Bible to memorize, which isn't entirely inaccurate, as it is literally just the 2 words, Jesus wept. So I was actually thinking when I was prepping for this message, I really hope that Keith Miller is here because he's our Bible memorization guy. So, but now you have you can say you have at least one verse memorized. Jesus wept. That's all you need. Jesus wept. But in the context, this really stands out. It's an abrupt little 2-word sentence that seems to just kind of come out of nowhere, especially when we consider that this is Jesus, who isn't just a good man, who isn't just a prophet. He is literally God. And as an all-knowing God, he knows exactly what's about to happen in a few minutes. Everyone else is purely human, so they can only see the present and the past. They are incapable of seeing the future. And, like them, we are also incapable of seeing the future. And, sometimes that frustrates us. That's one of the unfortunate realities of suffering or trials or grief or whatever you want to call it. When we are present in it, it can sometimes consume our focus. We can sometimes become so tunnel visioned, and all we can see is the wrong, the suffering, the trials that are going on right now, and not that things will eventually change, not that things will eventually get better. We only see what is happening right now in front of us. And that's what's happening here. The people can't see what will happen or how it will happen, and they might not have truly known or understood just how powerful Jesus is, that he'll be able to turn this whole thing around. We can kind of infer based on what Martha and Mary say that they thought he was a healer, that he could cure any incurable disease of the day, but no one can heal death. No one can turn that around, right? You don't give a Band-Aid to a corpse. But he knows what's about to happen. He knows his power and what will happen next, and yet he weeps. Why? Why does God weep? Because he's perfect. He's perfect love. He enters into the situation and doesn't close himself off or separate himself from the emotion of it just because he has the knowledge and the power to change everything in a few moments. And this shows us two things. First of all, and this is something that a lot of us struggle with, I know I sometimes do too, it's okay to cry. It's okay to weep, especially in these kinds of situations. It's not a new concept, but we live in a society, a culture that degrades tears, that sees them as a weakness, and especially amongst men. There's this idea that tears are for women and children, and men don't cry. Man up. Real men don't show too much emotion. Now, I'm not advocating that we start turning into snowflakes and crying at the drop of a hat, obviously. I'm saying that it is not wrong in the moments that fit to be able to show some emotion, to shed a tear or two. And really, if you think about it, it's the only emotion that we don't always feel comfortable showing. We don't have a whole lot of problems with showing anger when that flares up. Or, we have a good time with our friends and family, laughing, being happy, things like that. Those are fine. But when going through sadness, tragedy, grief, we don't have to be strong or hide the emotions that we're feeling. It's okay to let it out. It's healthy, and Jesus shows us it's part of the right way to express grief. In Christian circles, there's the idea that we shouldn't weep or be sad because we know the truth. We know that God is going to make all things new and glorify us when we die. But just because we know the truth doesn't mean we shouldn't express how we feel. God didn't make us to be robots. He made us to be living, breathing, feeling creatures. Jesus didn't lack any knowledge or wisdom or maturity or faith, and yet in this instance he weeps. He's open to the feelings. That's the first thing. The second thing that Jesus shows us with his tears is that we have a tendency to want to try to fix things. And again, this is very true amongst men. For most people, when something breaks, one of our first instincts is to try to fix it. When objects, physical objects break, when relationships break, when people break, we want to try to help them. We want to fix them. And especially when it comes to people going through trials, people struggling, I have to share this story because it fits perfectly with this whole thing. And I've actually heard it twice from two very different locations over the past several months. It's kind of a old North American native story. So a grandfather, there's always a grandfather in those kinds of stories, goes out with his grandson, and they're walking along in the woods, and the grandson notices a moth that is just about done in its cocoon there, and it's struggling to get out of its cocoon. And the boy turns to his grandfather and says, we should help the moth, we should help it out. And the grandfather says, I wouldn't advise it, but if that's what you want to do, go ahead. So the grandson takes out his knife and cuts the cocoon and helps the moth out. And the moth comes out, flaps its wings a few times, and then falls down to the ground dead. And the lesson there is that the moth needed that struggle. It needed to go through that coming out of the cocoon. It needed that time in order to have the strength to survive. It had to go through that trial, that struggle, so that it had the strength to keep going and do what it needed to do. So, we see people struggling and we want to help them. That's our first instinct, right? We want to help rectify their situation, make it better. But sometimes they need to go through that so they can become stronger. They can become what they need to be to continue on. Helping people who are going through hard times or trying to help ourselves when we're going through this process isn't always enough, or it's not appropriate. We have to recognize the struggle and be part of the emotions. In our passage, Jesus is living out what Paul says in the second part of Romans chapter 15, verse 12. Martha, Mary, their friends, their family, their neighbors are all weeping at the death of Lazarus. And so Jesus weeps with those who weep. When we know someone is going through a hard time, when someone is stuck in their grief, we can't fix it for them. We want to sometimes, but we can't. All we can do is be there for them, enter into what they're going through, and weep with them. For those of us who are in a season of struggle and going through grief, as hard as it may be, the best thing to do is to try to gravitate towards those who will be there for us and who will weep with us. The second way that Jesus shows us how to deal with grief is with his anger. That's right, his anger. Some of these things sound like I'm pulling them out of the 7 stages of grief model, but I promise this isn't that. We only have 4 things we're talking about. And while the 7 stages of grief may be a good model to help some people through their grief, it doesn't exactly take into the account the reality of God's kingdom. I did a little bit of research at one point on the 7 stages of grief, and the 3rd stage is anger and bargaining, kind of like what we're talking about here. The article I read said, "You may rail against fate, questioning why me. You may also try to bargain in vain with the powers that be for a way out of your despair." And those are pretty general statements, though those may be some of the things that we want to say to God when going through grief. Like I was saying earlier, we might sound like Martha or Mary with what they're saying, but in an angry tone. Let's focus on the anger that Jesus brings, though, because he does actually bring anger. And you might be flipping through your Bible, looking at the passage again and trying to find, where does it say that Jesus is angry? For whatever reason, and I have a theory as to why it is, and I'll get to that in a minute, but translators, both the ancient and the modern, are afraid to translate exactly what parts of the text say. In verse 33, when Jesus sees Mary and the other people who had come with her weeping, it's translated to say that he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. But the Greek word used there in that passage actually means to quake with rage. Everyone is crying, and Jesus is getting fired up. He's filling up with rage, and then he begins to weep. And then in verse 38, when it translates saying that Jesus was once again more deeply moved when he got to the tomb, that Greek word actually means to roar or snort in anger like an animal, like a lion or a bull. So a better translation is that when he got to the tomb, he was actually bellowing or yelling with anger. And that's usually one of the points we get to in our grief at some point. But usually we end up turning it on someone or something. We blame God. We get angry with him, or we get angry at the people around us, looking for ways to blame what we're feeling on others. And that's my theory as to why the translators don't want people to read that Jesus is angry in this situation, because it could easily be thought that Jesus is angry at the people if read from the viewpoint of anger. Or he's angry at Martha and Mary for pestering him with basically a word for word the exact same question, the exact same accusation. If Jesus had been there, Lazarus wouldn't have died. It could be read that Jesus is angry at the people for weeping because he's going up to do the healing, so there's no point in their weeping. Or it could be read that Jesus was angry at himself for not being there sooner. All of these things, though, they aren't Jesus. That's not who Jesus is. That's not who God is. Those are things that we do as humans. That's not where Jesus' rage is pointing towards. The progression of his rage shows it too. He's angry at death. His anger is placed in the tomb, and in response is to take that death and turn it into resurrection, to take what was and what died and not only bring it back, but make it better, which is the gospel story in a nutshell. Out of the old and broken comes the new and the redeemed. Death is the enemy. Death is the one to be angry with. Death is the result of sin. If there was no sin, there would be no death. So the best thing we can do is not be angry at God, or not be angry at anyone else, not be angry with ourselves. You know, one of the things I started to think when I was grieving over my friend was, you know, I wish I had been able to spend more time with him. I wish we had been able to be closer. You know, I wish we would have been able to be better friends like he was with some of the other guys. But that's focusing on the death. That's dwelling on the death. The best thing we can do is take the death and give it what really beats it, life. Not just the same old life, but life even better. And that's why a lot of times when we're talking about funerals, we talk about celebrating the life of the person. We talk about what we remember, the good times with them. You know, we do everything we can to not allow death to win. Remember what is lost, what has been swallowed up by death, but don't allow it to win. Death wins with more death. Death loses when we give life, when we speak life to those who are hurting, when we don't allow death to claim who we are by taking it out on those around us. Live life and live it well. And I think everyone who has passed would say that to us too. You know, live your life, live it well, right? There's a time for tears, there's a time for sadness, and eventually there is a time for anger. But when that anger comes, point it at the source and give it resurrection. Unlike Jesus, we can't necessarily resurrect our loved ones or the loved ones of others unless, of course, you know, it's God's will and a miracle happens. But what we can do is keep their memory alive and not allow that to die with them, to give them life beyond the grave. And that goes into our third point, our third way of Jesus, the third way that Jesus gives us for dealing with grief. And it actually kind of helps with both the first two, because there's a lot to try to weep, be open to those who are going through pain, and then also focusing anger and not using it to dismantle the whole process. Jesus gives us the third way, and the way of his truth to help. Our culture sees the way of dealing with grief and dealing with life in general, really, using a very general principle. If you work hard through it, somehow things will all get better. Jesus says that he can give us something so much more. When Martha meets him on the road, she says if he had been there, Lazarus would still be alive because he has been known to heal, but he hasn't been known to bring back the dead. He says Lazarus will rise again, and she says that she understands, he'll come back in the end. She understands the resurrection, unlike the Sadducees, who didn't believe in the resurrection. She believed it. She believed, at the end of it all, God would come back and resurrect us from the dead. But Jesus responds saying that I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Do we believe? Our culture has a hopeful, wishful type of thinking for things to get better. Jesus says he's God, and if we believe in him, we don't have to get a consolation prize. We get a resurrection prize. He isn't saying if we believe in him, if we trust in him, he'll take us away from all the tragedy, the pain, the grief, so that we can forget that it ever happened. That's what consolation is. He isn't saying he'll take us away to heaven, but that he's going to bring heaven down. He's going to restore what was lost 1,000,000 times over. He will resurrect and bring new life, better life, beyond what we could ever imagine. All the sin, the pain, the suffering, the sickness will be wiped clean and made right. It will be like waking up from a terrible dream. Like we're in the middle of the worst nightmare any of us could ever imagine. And eventually we will wake up in the morning from that nightmare. You know, when we have nightmares, they feel so real. You know, dreams, they feel so real sometimes. I sometimes have a hard time distinguishing when I'm dreaming that it's a dream. But you know, I wake up and I realize it was just a dream. It wasn't reality. We wake up and everything that happened in the dream becomes untrue. And that's what Jesus promises, not just the next best thing, not just to take it all away, but to make this world to just be a nightmare, and the morning is coming, the real world is coming. That is the truth that we can hold on to for ourselves, for those we've lost, for those around us that have lost. All the bad things that have ever happened on this earth are taken up only in such a way that it makes the glory of God that much greater and better for having that time of brokenness. Everything will be healed, and not only that, but made up for. You know, I've brought this sermon on grief one other time before, and it's one of my favorites that I've ever preached. But there's also another one that focuses a lot more on the suffering and the trials that I've done. This one's more about the grief. But when I was preparing what I was going to preach for this Sunday, because Glenn asked me to preach November 10th, like months ago, because I was like, if you ever need me to preach anytime, he was like, November 10th. I was like, all right, let's do it. So as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about, what message could I bring, what was appropriate for this time of year and this season that people are generally going through. And I kept coming with this suffering, trials, grief, you know, all of those things. And so this other message that I have more on suffering and trials has to do with the story of the fiery furnace in Daniel chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. One of the 3 boys who were thrown into the fiery furnace is saying, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and we believe that he will deliver us from it, your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up. The world sees death as a finality, an end. That's it, no more. The end of life is the end. But as Christians, we know that it's not. We know that God is able to save us, and we believe that he will save us. And we don't love him for that. We love him for who he is. You know, that's what we all want. We don't want people to love us for what we do for them or the things we give them or anything like that. We want people to love us for us. And that's what they're saying, and that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saying in this passage. It's not that God, you know, is able to deliver us that we love him. It's not that we believe he will save us that we love him. It's because he's God. We love him. We choose him over your idols, over your death threats, over anything that you can throw at us. We love God. We love him for who he is. And part of who he is, he's the truth. And the truth is that he will save us. Jesus didn't just heal Lazarus, he brought him back to life. Jesus did not just heal his wounds on the cross, he was resurrected. He took on the sin of the world and was killed so that we could have everything made new in him. And if we believe that, if we hold on to this truth of the gospel, grief takes on a new shape. We can face anything coming from that perspective, but especially grief. And we can lift up those who are struggling and grieving by reminding them or sharing with them this truth that Jesus gave us. That there is resurrection, that there is life, that death is not the end. The world says death is the end. Jesus says no, there's more. And the thing about these four things that we see Jesus doing to handle grief, it's not as though it's like a step-by-step, this is the time to cry, this is the time to be angry, this is the time to accept the truth. It's not like that. These are all keys to helping us with our grief, and different ones can and should happen at different times throughout the whole process. But the fourth and final way that Jesus gives us to deal with grief can be seen towards the end, after Jesus had resurrected Lazarus. This chapter is broken up into two sections. There's the first half about Lazarus getting sick and dying and Jesus coming to resurrect him. And then there's the second half, which is really summed up in verse 53. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. This was the miracle that did it. The Pharisees, they had issues with him for a while. They wanted to pick up stones and stone him and have him killed before, but now they're actually planning. They're plotting. They're going to execute a plan to make sure that he dies. We can see that it had been prophesied that it would happen. The chief priest that year said that it was going to happen and would save not just those in the Jewish nation, but those who were scattered. And it specifically says God's children, which I'm sure from their perspective, they're looking at that and interpreting it, the people of Israel that were scattered. But as Gentile believers, we look at that and say that their perspective was too narrow. All of God's children will be saved and made one, Jews and Gentiles. But this is the miracle that makes them start plotting to kill him. Does anyone else see what this means? It means that the fourth way of dealing with grief is through him, through his sacrifice, through his presence, through his grace, the grace that the resurrection of his friend Lazarus meant his own death. Giving life meant giving up his own life. And of course he knew that. He made the deliberate choice. The only way to end Lazarus' funeral was to cause his own. And this is the gospel. We serve a God that is so committed to the end of suffering and death and grief that he was willing to come into the world and enter into it so that suffering and death, he could see to an end to them. I'm sure we've all heard or may have even escaped our own lips at one point or another. Sometimes when going through hard times, people wonder if God really cares about our suffering. Or we can wonder how God could exist and be truly good with all the suffering that happens in the world. But Christianity is the only religion in the world that shows that he does in fact care and that he is good and that he did something about it. He sent his son to suffer and die for us. He cares. He isn't just a transcendent holy God that, just made us and took off. He's an intimate, caring, loving God that showed his grace on the cross. He shows his grace by giving us what we need. Look at the two situations between Martha and Mary. Coming from almost the same place, they're sisters, it's their brother. They say almost the exact same thing to Jesus. But with Martha, Jesus gives us a little bit more. He gives her the truth that she needed to hear. And with Mary, he gave her his tears. He wept with her. He's the perfect counselor. Sometimes we're going through things and we meet with a counselor and they are strictly one or the other for everyone. They're either only speaking the truth and trying to fix things, or they only weep and enter into the emotions, regardless of who is seeing them. And I don't have enough counseling experience personally to know which one of those two I would be. If I had to guess, as someone who does really like to fix things, and with some of the counseling experience that I do have, I would probably be the one that's sharing the truth and trying to fix everybody's problems and everyone's situations, trying to give them answers and solutions to their problems. That's just the kind of person that I am. But Jesus, in his grace, gives exactly what we need when we need it. That's why, he's the boss and I'm not. So we need to go to him, seek him out in prayer, express our suffering or our trials or our grief to him. He shares it with us. Going back to that fiery furnace message, there's another connection. Towards the end of that passage, as I'm sure you all know, it talks about how God's walking around in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what I pulled from in that message was that God is the God who doesn't leave us alone in our furnaces, in our suffering, in our trials. He walks alongside us. He walks through us. He walks with us through those times of suffering and hardship. But not only just that, knowing that in order to save us, Jesus walked through the ultimate furnace all alone. He suffered what we were meant to suffer, so what we suffer on earth pales in comparison to everything that he went through. He did that for us and for the souls of those we love that we've lost. We don't have to walk alone. We walk beside a furnace expert, and neither do those we've lost. Sometimes excuse me. Sometimes that doesn't always feel like it's enough, just knowing that Jesus is walking alongside us. But he uses us as his body, as his instruments, so we can turn to our brothers and sisters for his support. As closing, I'd like to call the worship team back up for one more song. And it is my hope and prayer that these words that I brought this morning come straight from God and are exactly what someone here needed to hear today. It's my hope and prayer that we may have a better understanding of what it means to grieve and go through hard times, that we may know a little better on knowing exactly how to be there for someone who's going through these things. It's emotional and it's spiritual, and it's not by any means easy. But when we're here, we're not alone. When we're driving to work, we're not alone. And when we're together,